Today I want to share with you how to make a banana bread with step-by-step instructions for the beginner. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel. And don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Well, this banana bread couldn't be easier to make, and it's perfect for beginners. You really can't go wrong, and you're going to get a nice rise out of it. The first thing that you're going to need are 2 cups of flour. And this is very flexible. You can use 2 cups of all-purpose flour if you want. You can even use bread flour if that's all you have on hand. Now what I've got here is 1½ cups of all-purpose flour and 1/2 cup of whole wheat flour. Now if you're in the process of making the transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and you do have some whole grain flours on hand, and you have been incorporating them into your baking, this is a good time to use some of those whole grain flours. And you can use 1/2 cup, or you can use more than that to replace the all-purpose flour. The only difference you'll notice if you use all whole grain flour is that your banana bread will be slightly denser. And although today I'm using whole wheat flour here, you can use any whole grain flour that you have. If you have spelt, you can use that. If you have einkorn, you can use that. Any whole grain flour will work. Now the next ingredient that you're going to need is some sugar. And how much sugar you use is really going to depend on how ripe your bananas are. And the browner the skins of the banana, the better, because the browner the skins, the sweeter the fruit. Now what I've got here is 1 cup of white sugar, and this is just an organic, unbleached sugar. And I'm using white sugar today because I think that's probably the most common and what most people may have on hand right now. Now, if you find that your bananas are very dark, and when you open them up, you can always take a little taste, and if they're very sweet, you can definitely decrease the sugar. You can use 3/4 cup or 1/2 cup, whatever you think might be appropriate in terms of a good sweetness for your bread. And if you are in the process of making that transition from a processed food kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and you've started incorporating more whole sugars into your pantry, you can definitely use that in place of the white sugar. You can use the dried cane juice, normally sold under the name sucanat. You can use maple sugar. You can use date sugar, any type of dry sugar like that. Now you can also use liquid sweeteners in this recipe. You could use honey, you could use maple syrup. However, if you decide to do that, you would have to cut back a little bit on the amount of banana that you put into your recipe. When we mash this up, we're going to have about 1.5 cups or so of mashed banana. And if you are using a liquid sweetener, you're probably going to want to cut that back to about 1 cup of mashed banana, because the liquid sweetener will make the bread a little denser, and you don't want to add too much moisture, so to speak, to make the bread too moist or too dense. And the bananas are adding a lot of moisture and a lot of denseness, and then the liquid sweetener is also doing the same. So you have to even things out a little. But I don't want you to worry. You don't need to write any of this down. I will put all of this in the written recipe over on my website. It's the same name as the YouTube channel, Mary's Nest. But there will be a link in the description under this video, and it'll be a direct link, and it'll take you right over to the recipe that you can read online or print out. And I'll include information on all these variations, so you'll have all of the options as to whatever ingredients you want to add and what adjustments you need to make. Next, you're going to need a teaspoon of baking soda. And don't worry if the baking soda that you have shows that it's expired. It may still work in this recipe, and you can test it by just adding a little vinegar to a little bit of the baking soda, and if it froths up, it's fine and it'll work. And you can use any kind of vinegar you have on hand, including one that you've made homemade. And then you're going to want 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and this is just a fine ground sea salt that I have, but you can use any salt that you have. And then you're going to want 1/2 cup of chopped nuts, and you can use any type of chopped nuts that you like. I'm using pecans because I live in Central Texas and pecans are very common here. But if you have walnuts or hazelnuts, anything like that will work. And if you don't want any nuts, you can leave them out. Now I'm including the chopped nuts with the dry ingredients, and the reason is it's nice to have the nuts, or even if you wanted to use some sort of chopped dried fruit, it's nice to have whatever ingredient that you add in this category tossed with the flour, because that helps them stay well distributed throughout your banana bread, or any quick bread for that matter, and not all sink to the bottom. So now we'll just go ahead and we'll add in our dry ingredients. That was our 1 cup of sugar, and again, you can adjust that if your bananas are very brown. I have got that 1 teaspoon of baking soda, and then the 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Then the next thing that you want to do is get a whisk, a wooden spoon, spatula, whatever you have, and you want to give this a real good stir. You want to make sure that everything is well distributed, that that baking soda and that salt and the sugar is well distributed throughout the flour. Once you make sure everything's well mixed, just go ahead and sprinkle in your nuts and just toss them in the flour, or the flour mixture. Now we're going to set our dry ingredients aside, and we're going to get another bowl to prepare our wet ingredients. And what we're doing is keeping the dry ingredients and the wet ingredients separate until we're ready to mix them and combine them. And that's known as the muffin method. There are 2 ways to make quick breads, basically 2 ways, and one is the muffin method and one is the creaming method. The muffin method is what we're doing today, and I find this the easiest and the most foolproof, because you're just going to have your dry, have your wet, put your wet in your dry, mix it gently, put it in your pan, and bake it. The creaming method involves creaming softened butter and sugar together, and then adding the eggs in one at a time and making sure they're well combined. But that can sometimes be a little confusing to beginners to know if they've got it creamed perfectly, because that's very important that it is creamed perfectly in order to make sure that you get a good rise out of your cake. Or not your cake, it comes cake-like when you do the creaming method. So I tend to think of it a little more like cake. You don't want it to be flat, you don't want it to sink in the middle. You want to also have a nice rise like we're going to get with the muffin method. And so you need to really make sure that the sugar and the butter are creamed well, and then you put in 1 egg at a time and make sure that that's well incorporated. And that can be a little confusing when you are a new baker. So I recommend doing it this way to make it easier for you and more likely that you'll have success. Now basically you're going to need about 3 large bananas. My bananas are a little small, so I've got 4 here. And the reason that I used a cup of sugar was these have some browning to them, but not as brown as I normally would like, to be able to decrease that sugar to 3/4 of a cup or even 1/2 a cup. So that's why I used the full cup of sugar. Now, what you want to do is you're just going to peel these, and we're going to just break them up and put them into our bowl. Now, don't throw these banana skins out. And if you know me by now, if you've been with me for a while, you know I don't like to waste anything. But banana skins decompose very quickly, so these are wonderful to be used or to throw into your compost pile. And if you do a search on the internet for uses for banana peels, you're going to find all kinds of ideas. One is that you can make a tea out of them by just putting them in some water, bringing it up to a boil, I think letting it simmer for about 10 minutes, and then it makes a nice tea that is apparently supposed to help you sleep. It's worth a try. And other ideas are that you can take this inside of the peel and use this to polish silver. I've also read that if you have acne, you can rub this on your skin, and it's supposed to help with that. So be sure to check out what you can do with banana peels, because there's quite a plethora of information about it all on the internet. Now, if you have a lot of bananas that are turning brown and more than what you would need for today's recipe, you can go ahead and freeze them. You can freeze them with the peels on or without the peels on. I find it works better if you peel them and then put them in a freezer-safe bag, which helps tamp down freezer burn, and freeze them that way. Then you can freeze them in the amounts that you would need for this bread, or you could freeze them individually if you were thinking of maybe using them for smoothies or something like that. But I find having them peeled is much easier when you go to defrost them and are ready to use them in whatever way you're planning. If you freeze them with the skins on or the peels on, you have to let them defrost a little to remove the peels, and it can sometimes, I find, become a little bit of a mushy mess. But it's up to you. If you feel that leaving the peels on does protect them a little more from freezer burn, that's fine. But I usually freeze them unpeeled. I usually freeze them peeled. So now all we want to do is go in and mash these bananas. And we don't want to make them a big mushy, watery mess. All you're going to do is just take your fork and just start smashing them a little. You just want them sort of in smashed chunks. And now, if you have one of these potato mashers, this works great too. But a fork will do the trick, definitely. Now for the next wet ingredient, you're going to need 2 large eggs. Now don't worry if you don't have large eggs. If you have smaller medium eggs, just use 3. If they're just farm eggs and you're not really sure, you can go ahead and use 3. This is very forgiving. Just break your eggs into a bowl and then just give them a little beating with a fork to give them a good mixing. So we'll go ahead and add in our eggs, right in with our banana. And the next thing that we're going to need is a 1/4 cup of sour cream. But don't worry if you don't have sour cream. You can use a 1/4 cup of yogurt. You could use a 1/4 cup of buttermilk. You could use just a 1/4 cup of milk. Put a little tiny squirt of lemon juice or vinegar in it to help thicken it a little bit. Anything like that will work. And what this does, it really helps to create a nice, light crumb to the texture of the banana bread. It does add moisture, but it's more, I'm not quite sure how to describe it. It just gives it a nice lightness. Any type of sort of cultured product like this, a sour cream or a yogurt or a buttermilk, it always helps lighten quick breads or muffins, and I think you'll be very pleased with the final texture. Next, we're going to add in a little bit of vanilla, and that's just a teaspoon of vanilla. And you can use the store-bought, or if you make your own homemade, you can definitely use your homemade vanilla here. Now, before we add in the butter, we're just going to go ahead and incorporate the bananas and the sour cream and the eggs and the vanilla, just to give this a little turnaround. Now, I want to talk about the butter. If you don't have any butter, don't worry. You can, if you have ghee or the clarified butter, you can use that in this recipe. If you want to use coconut oil, you can also use that. And those do tend to be solid at room temperature. So just like the butter here, I've got 1 stick of melted butter. You'll want to just melt those so that they are in liquid form. However, you want to make sure that they're cooled up to room temperature, because you don't want to cook your eggs when you go ahead and add it into your mixture. You can also use oil if you want, and you would use a 1/2 cup of oil. You could use a mild flavored olive oil, you could use an avocado oil, and if you're using an oil, you can go ahead and add it right in with all the other wet ingredients when you do this. You can just do that in one step. When I use a fat that's more solid at room temperature, I like to first mix everything else well with the banana before I add in the butter, because if I add in the butter right away, it tends to sort of seize up a little more and start to become more solid. And we really want to be using a fat, since we're doing the muffin method and we're not creaming room temperature butter with sugar as in the creaming method. You really want whatever fat you're using to stay more liquid. So that's why I just like to give all of this a little bit of a good incorporation before I add the butter. Now we'll go ahead and add in our melted butter. And I'm just going to give this a good mix in. I'm just going to use my whisk. You can continue to use the spatula if you want, or a wooden spoon. Whatever you have will work just fine. We just want to make sure all of that's well incorporated. Now, before we mix the wet into the dry, I just want to mention that you'll want to make sure that the rack in your oven is on the lower third part of your oven. And that's going to help your banana bread bake thoroughly, but not over brown on the top. And your oven should be preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And you'll want to have a loaf pan. This is just a 9x5 standard loaf pan. And you'll want to grease it really well with butter. And if you have parchment paper, you can make a little sleeve like this, or a little lifter that you would put into your pan, and grease your pan first and then put your parchment paper in. It makes it a little easier to give the parchment paper something to stick to, and then grease the parchment paper once again. And then this makes it very easy to lift the banana bread out of the pan. However, if you grease your pan really, really well with butter, it is going to release and come out very nicely. Now, if you're using a different type of fat, you can grease it very well with coconut oil or some other oil that you're using, but you just want to make sure that whatever you use, that it's greased very well. Now, what we want to do is just basically make a well right in the middle of our dry ingredients. It's just like a little indentation. Then we're going to take our wet ingredients and we're going to pour them right into that well. And we just want to get out every little bit of goodness from here. Then all you're going to do is very gently start incorporating the wet and the dry together. And you don't want to overmix. You want to do this with a very gentle hand. And all you're going to try to do is to make sure all of the dry ingredients are coated with the wet, or coated by the wet ingredients. And just go down and around and scoop up from the bottom to get any flour that's down there. And just keep doing this very gently. It's really not going to take you very long. It's going to come together literally within seconds, as you can see. And I'll overlay a close-up video so that you can follow along with me as I'm just turning this around, just to make sure all of those dry ingredients have gotten wet with the wet ingredients. And there we have it. It's going to take you about 30 seconds at most. Then we're just going to transfer this right into our pan. It's going to be lumpy because we're not overmixing. Overmixing is the enemy of a quick bread. And the reason is, when you overmix a quick bread, you activate the gluten. Now, when you're making a yeast risen bread, you want to knead the bread because you do want to activate the gluten. But in this case, what's giving the rise to this bread is the baking soda. And so we don't want to overactivate the gluten because that would make this tough and not a nice, tender quick bread. So just get every little bit out. And then we'll smooth it out and we'll get ready to put it in the oven. You can just smooth out the top with your spatula, or you can just give it a little shake to get the batter into all the nooks and crannies. But that's it, you're all set. Now we're going to go ahead and put this right into the oven, and it'll take about anywhere from 50 to 60 minutes to bake. Now, I recommend that you definitely check your banana bread at 50 minutes. Everyone's oven is slightly different, so your banana bread may be ready at 50 minutes. If it's risen nicely and it's a pretty golden brown on top, just test it with a toothpick. Take a toothpick, put it in the center. If you pull the toothpick out and it's dry, or it's just got a few little dry crumbs on it, your banana bread is ready. If it still has a little bit of batter on it, the wet batter, then it needs to cook longer, and it'll probably need another 10 minutes. Now, the fact that we're baking this in the lower third of the oven should prevent the top of your banana bread from getting over browned. However, if at 50 minutes you find that it is a nice golden brown, but when you do the toothpick test, there's still some batter left on it, on the toothpick, then you can make a little tent of aluminum foil and simply put that on top of your banana bread and then let your banana bread bake for the additional 10 minutes. It will bake through and be cooked, but it won't brown anymore on top. Well, I just took this out of the oven and look at this glorious banana bread and the aroma. Oh, you really smell the bananas. It just is beautiful. Now, just give it a few minutes in the pan, and if you've used the parchment paper, it's going to come out very easily. We can just lift this right up like that. Ooh, wish me luck. Now, if you didn't use the parchment paper, but you greased the inside of your pan very well, you should be able to, this is still a little hot, but you should be able to tip your pan over and get your banana bread out without any problem. But if you feel that maybe it's stuck a little in one of the corners, not to worry. Just take a knife and just go around the edges, and that should loosen it. Now, my banana bread took exactly 60 minutes. I tested it at 50 minutes, but when I did the toothpick test and inserted the toothpick in the middle, there was still a little bit of moist batter on the toothpick, so I let it go the additional 60 minutes. Now, there's something that I want to say about timing and quick breads. Quick breads can sometimes take their sweet time, and a lot can depend on, as I said, everyone's oven is different, the conditions in your kitchen are different, the weather outside plays a role. So if at 60 minutes you go to do the toothpick test and your banana bread still isn't ready, don't worry, it just needs probably another 5 or 10 minutes. And if it's on the lower rack, hopefully it's not browning too much, but if it is, you can always do a foil tent and then just check it maybe at 65 minutes and hopefully it'll be ready. If not, by 70 minutes, it should definitely be ready. Well, I let the banana bread cool a little bit on the cooling rack, and technically we should let quick breads cool completely. It's still a little warm, but I think we'll go ahead and cut it. I'm just so pleased with how this turned out, and I just want to hold this up and show you, and I'll put in a close-up picture as well. Look at the glorious rise on this. This is what I love on a quick bread. I love a nice crown to it. I don't like it when they come flat. I love a nice crown. Now this has a nice crisp crust. I think you'll be able to hear this. Can you hear that? I really like that. But if you like the top of your banana bread to be very soft, what you can do is when you take it out of the oven and you transfer it to the cooling rack and it's still warm, just cover it with some aluminum foil and that'll make this top very soft. Well, let's give this a slice, and I just want you to hear this again. It's such a nice crispy crust. I like that the best. What I'm going to do is I'm going to slice this end piece, and oh gosh, look at this gloriousness. I'll take some close-up shots, but I want to just slice another piece too, so you can really get a good look at this bread. And as I said, I'll take some close-up pictures and overlay them. Ooh, it's quite warm. I'm slicing it a little early. But look at this beautiful banana bread. Just perfect. The aroma of the bananas is just heavenly. And you know, if you I like to just keep it simple like this, but if you do like to add in cinnamon or nutmeg or cloves or allspice, you can do that at the point when you're mixing in your flours. You can put in a teaspoon of cinnamon or so on and so forth, whatever spice you want to use. But I highly recommend trying it this way first, because the aroma of the bananas is just heavenly. Well, let's give it a taste. Mmm. 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 It's delicious. This is so delicious, I had to take a second bite. You're gonna love this bread. It's flavorful, it's so tender, and the aroma is just heavenly, and it's so easy to make. Well, if you'd like to learn how to make more breads like this, quick breads without yeast, or no-knead breads that do use yeast, or even advance on to sourdough, then be sure to click on this video over here, where I show you how to make all different types of breads for you to choose from. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.